So, with no further ado, what's clear as you peruse the existing literature is that substance abuse in the elderly, and we're going to define that today as simply 65 and older, we're going to make that arbitrary designation, is one of the fastest growing health problems facing our nation. You know, and we know the cohort, you know, over 60, right now about 30-odd million, maybe 35-odd million, and by 2020 we're expecting that to be 60 million, so almost a fourth of our population. So a very large cohort that's growing very rapidly. And as you'll soon see, the use of drugs in this population, prescription drugs, is what we're zeroing in on today, is massive. And as I mentioned earlier, we haven't seen a lot of research on alcohol and drug abuse in the elderly, and there's a number of reasons here. Much of the research on alcohol and drug abuse is federal agenda. It's you know, granted, it's funded, I should say, by the federal government, and they zero in on a different demographic, and they zero in primarily on illicit, illegal drugs. Second piece to this is that, you know, we all suffer from the nice little old lady, nice little old man phenomenon. It's almost incomprehensible that these folks who have weathered many storms would be abusing substances, prescription drugs, or alcohol. So it's just really not in our radar, if you will. And the third piece is, in this country in the 60s, we went through a transformation. You know, the drug era. You think about the history of our country in the 1900s through 1950, and alcohol. We went through a period of prohibition. Prescription drugs were relatively rare. Certainly illegal and illicit drugs were minimal. There were lots of religious proscriptions against it. Even here in the great state of Texas, we still have a number of dry counties. But all that changed in the 60s, and government funding kind of headed to a whole different section and a whole different population. But in terms of looking at drug abuse in the elderly, it's really kind of minimal research. The other piece to this is that compared to young adults, substance abuse in the elderly shows up as a medical or psychiatric condition, not as a florid drug problem. So it's somewhat disguised. But bullet 2 is, I think, really kind of the center of this. This is maybe a variation on don't ask, don't tell. Substance abuse goes undetected. The screening tools that clinicians use in younger populations may not apply in seniors. DSM-4 criteria, which is the psychiatrist's Bible, the diagnostic and statistical manual for abuse and dependence, which implies that abuse means continued use has adverse consequences, and dependence simply means that abuse leads to adverse consequences, and there's tolerance, and there's withdrawal, and there's loss of control. Well, those criteria are often applied to how people function socially, how they function occupationally. So what do we know about the elderly? Well, perhaps they drive very little, if at all, so they're not going to run into problems with DUIs, okay, very few problems. They're retired, so they're probably not going to run into problems occupationally. And because they're older and may have health problems, there may be very little social interaction. So the criteria that we would ordinarily apply in a younger population may not exactly fit in the elderly. And then the last one is kind of unwritten, unspoken. You know, there's this sort of pervasive idea that substance abuse in the elderly can't be treated. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's the assumption that we're in the 9th inning and there are 2 outs, and why bother? I hope that's not the case. In fact, that kind of goes to the earlier commandment, one can teach an old dog new tricks. But that's sort of a pervasive belief. Now here's the part that changes everything. I happen to be a baby boomer, born in 1952, and you can see the window that defines baby boomer, 1946 to 1964. That's clearly changing and will dramatically change the future clinical landscape in geriatrics, and especially in terms of substance abuse in the elderly. And the reason for this is this cohort of people grew up in a different time and place in terms of widespread use of prescription drugs that has little or no stigma because they are, quote, safe. A doctor prescribes them. This cohort grew up in the era where recreational and illegal drug experimentation was not morally prohibited. In fact, on some level, it was perhaps encouraged and flourished. So this population has experience with substances. This population is very familiar with prescription drugs, very familiar with illicit drugs. So there's a strong evidence that by 2020, the number of elders 50 and older that need treatment for substance abuse disorders is going to double and perhaps triple from where we're at in this is data from 2010. So the baby boomer cohort simply changes the landscape and will change the landscape in the future.